At 14 degrees north latitude, where the Texas Panhandle meets the Oklahoma border, the land remembers what it means to die. In 1935, this exact spot was ground zero for the worst environmental catastrophe in American history. The soil wasn't just dry, it was airborne, moving east at 50 miles per hour in walls of dust 500 feet high. But here is the strange part. If you drive through this same landscape today and know where to look, you will find something that should not exist. Living monuments, some 80 feet tall, arranged in perfect geometric lines that stretch beyond the horizon. These are the survivors of what might be the most audacious environmental engineering project ever attempted. In the summer of 1934, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that sounded insane. Take thousands of unemployed men, give them shovels, and have them plant saplings in the middle of the worst drought in recorded history. Not a few trees. 220 million trees planted by hand, in a place where every expert said trees could not grow. The plan was to build a wall of trees 100 miles wide and 1,300 miles long, from Canada to Mexico, straight through America's dying heartland. Critics called it madness. One congressman said they were trying to grow a forest where God himself would not let a cactus survive. Oklahoma's governor laughed it off as a fantasy dreamed up by bureaucrats who had never seen real drought. The timing could not have been worse. The region had just experienced Black Sunday, when 300,000 tons of topsoil lifted off the ground in a single afternoon. Static electricity from the friction of dust particles made barbed wire fences glow blue. Cars had to drag chains to avoid exploding from the electrical charge. In Dodge City, the streetlights came on at 2 in the afternoon because the sun had disappeared behind a wall of dirt. The government's response was to send boys barely out of their teens, armed with 6-inch seedlings of green ash and cottonwood. The trees were so small you could snap them between 2 fingers. The soil was so degraded it moved like water. And yet, 7 years later, those impossible trees had become an 18,000-mile network of living barriers. The survival rate hit 82%. Wheat yields jumped 25%. The soil stopped moving. This is the story of how they did it. 600 miles inland from the Rocky Mountains, at the geometric center of North America, the Great Plains exist in a state of permanent atmospheric violence. The land here is flat. So flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. There is nothing to slow the wind. It builds momentum from the Arctic, accelerates across 2,000 miles of prairie, and by the time it reaches Texas, it is moving with the force of an invisible river. This is the engine that created the Dust Bowl, but wind alone does not destroy land. You need a second ingredient: exposed soil. Before European settlement, the plains were covered in buffalo grass and bluestem, plants that sent roots 15 feet deep into the earth. These grasses evolved over millennia to survive 100-year droughts and 1,000-mile winds. Their root systems were so dense that early settlers called the prairie-sod Nebraska marble, because plows would break before the earth would. A single square yard of native prairie contained 25 miles of root fiber. This was the land's immune system, a living net that held 200 million acres of topsoil in place. Then, between 1900 and 1930, farmers destroyed it. They had a new tool called the disc plow, pulled by tractors that could rip through the deepest roots. Wheat prices were high. The government was paying farmers to plant fence to fence. In 3 decades, 100 million acres of native grassland became wheat fields. They called it the Great Plow-Up. What they had actually done was remove the land's skin. The physics of what happened next are brutal in their simplicity. Wind erosion follows a cubic law. Double the wind speed and you increase its carrying capacity 8 times. Triple it, and the increase is 27 times. Once soil particles start moving, they become projectiles that knock other particles loose in a chain reaction. By 1934, this process had gone exponential. The first dust storms were local, a field here, a county there. But as more soil became airborne, the storms merged. They formed systems that meteorologists had never seen before. They became black blizzards that moved like hurricanes made of dirt. On May 9, 1934, a single storm carried 350 million tons of topsoil from the Great Plains to the Atlantic Ocean. Ships 300 miles out to sea reported dust falling on their decks. In Chicago, the dust was so thick that airplane pilots couldn't see the ground from 5,000 feet. The soil of Kansas was falling like snow on the steps of the Capitol building. The human wreckage matched the ecological collapse. By 1935, 3.5 million people had abandoned the plains. They called them exodusters. Families loaded everything they owned onto trucks and drove west with no destination except away. The ones who stayed faced a new disease called dust pneumonia. The silica particles in the air were so fine they penetrated deep into lung tissue, turning pink flesh into something that looked like concrete. Hundreds died, mostly children and the elderly. In the worst-hit counties of Kansas and Oklahoma, crop yields didn't just decline, they hit absolute zero. Not a single bushel of wheat, not one ear of corn. The land had stopped producing food entirely. John Steinbeck visited the region and wrote that it looked like the ruins of civilization, as if some great war had been fought and lost. What he was seeing was the mathematical endpoint of desertification, when the feedback loops of erosion become self-reinforcing and irreversible. The technical term is ecosystem collapse. Farmers had a simpler word. They called it hell. 700 miles northeast of the dying wheat fields, in a Forest Service office in Lincoln, Nebraska, a Russian immigrant named Raphael Zahn was drawing diagrams that looked like engineering blueprints. But instead of bridges or buildings, he was designing forests. Zahn had spent years studying the steppes of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, landscapes identical to the American plains, flat, dry, and dominated by wind. The Soviets had discovered something counterintuitive. You could not stop the wind, but you could lift it. If you placed a barrier at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right porosity, you could make the wind jump over farmland like water over a dam. The physics were elegant. A solid wall creates turbulence. The wind slams into it, shoots upward, then crashes down on the other side with even more violence. But a porous barrier, something that lets 40% of the wind through, creates what engineers call laminar flow. The wind rises smoothly, stays elevated, and does not touch the ground again for a distance equal to 20 times the height of the barrier. Plant a row of 60-foot cottonwoods, and you have just created 1,200 feet of protected ground. String together enough of these barriers, and you could engineer the microclimate of an entire region. But Zahn's plan required precision. The Forest Service designed a standard Shelterbelt with the specifications of a machine. 10 rows, 165 feet wide, oriented exactly perpendicular to the prevailing wind. The first 2 rows were shrubs, caragana and chokecherry, planted so dense they were almost touching. These acted like a cowcatcher on a train, forcing the wind to rise before it hit the main barrier. Rows 3 and 4 were medium trees, Russian olive and wild plum, that created a ramp effect, accelerating the upward momentum. The center rows 5 through 7 were the giants, cottonwood, green ash, and hackberry, that could reach 80 feet at maturity. These provided the height factor that determined how far downwind the protection would extend. The final rows were conifers, red cedar and ponderosa pine. These stayed green all winter when the deciduous trees were bare, maintaining the barrier effect during the critical months when the wind was strongest. But here's where the project revealed its genius. They did not treat these trees like a forest, they treated them like a crop. Every farmer who joined the program signed a contract requiring them to cultivate the ground between the tree rows for 5 years. No grass, no weeds, just bare cultivated soil. This looked backward to anyone who understood erosion, but it was the secret that made everything work. In a drought, every plant is competing for the same water. Prairie grass is aggressive. Its roots will dominate the top 3 feet of soil and steal every drop of rain. By keeping the ground bare, the trees were forced to send their roots deep, punching through the hardpan to reach geological water 30 feet down. This turned them into living pumps, pulling moisture from depths no crop could reach. The cultivation technique came from Russian dry land farming, something Zahn had studied in the Soviet agricultural stations. It was mechanical, not biological. Use steel to kill competition. Force the trees to become drought-proof by giving them no other option. At the northern edge of the first planted zone near Orchard, Nebraska, where John Schleusner had planted the very first Shelterbelt on April 23, 1935, something unexpected happened in the third year. The trees, which everyone said would die, were not just surviving, they were exploding upward. The cottonwoods were growing 6 feet per year. The Russian olives had formed an impenetrable wall, and between the rows in the cultivated soil, something else was happening. The ground was changing color. The gray, depleted dust was turning dark brown. Organic matter from fallen leaves was mixing with the soil. Earthworms appeared. The soil was coming back to life. By 1938, farmers started noticing changes that could not be explained by rainfall alone. Snow that used to blow clear to the next county was now piling up in 10-foot drifts inside the tree lines. When spring came, this snow did not run off. It melted slowly, soaking into the ground. The water table, which had been dropping for a decade, started rising. Wells that had gone dry began flowing again. Behind the shelter belts, the air felt different. Humidity rose by 15%. Wind speed at crop height dropped by 60%. The temperature swung less wildly, cooler in the day, warmer at night. The trees were not just blocking wind, they were manufacturing weather. The biological cascade was even more dramatic. The shelter belts created something the Great Plains had never had: vertical habitat. Within 5 years, ornithologists counted 64 bird species nesting in the tree lines. Hawks and owls used the tall cottonwoods as hunting platforms. Songbirds that could not survive in open grassland suddenly had territory. These birds did not just live in the trees, they patrolled the adjacent crops, consuming billions of grasshoppers and aphids. Farmers reported pest damage dropping by 50% without using a single pesticide. Ring-necked pheasants and bobwhite quail, game birds that generated millions in hunting revenue, used the dense cedar rows as shelter during blizzards. Without this cover, they would freeze to death in the open fields. The trees had created an economy. By 1942, when the project officially ended, the Prairie States Forestry Project had planted 220 million trees across 6 states, 18,600 miles of shelter belts protecting 30,000 farms. The survival rate, which critics had predicted would be 10%, averaged 82%. Even in 1936, the driest year ever recorded, over half the trees survived. In the protected zones, wheat yields increased 25%. Corn yields rose 15%. The soil erosion rate dropped by 87%. The math was undeniable. A shelter belt that took 5% of a field out of production increased the yield of the remaining 95% by enough to create a net gain. The trees were paying for themselves in grain. Today, if you stand at the border between a protected field and an unprotected one, you can see the line from a mile away. On one side, rich black soil and green crops. On the other, struggling plants and exposed dirt. It's the same rainfall, the same seed, the same fertilizer. The only difference is the presence or absence of a living wall that manipulates the physics of moving air. Some of the original belts still stand, now 80 feet tall, monuments to what happens when you engineer an ecosystem instead of just farming it. The Schleusner planting, that first desperate attempt 9 days after Black Sunday, is still there. The cottonwoods are giants now, their trunks 6 feet in diameter. Here is the irony that would have killed Raphael Zahn. The shelter belts worked so well that people forgot why they needed them. Starting in the 1970s, farmers began ripping them out. Center pivot irrigation systems need perfect circles of open ground, and the trees were in the way. In Nebraska alone, 57% of the original plantings have been destroyed. The guardians of the soil, The machines that broke the wind are now being fed into wood chippers to make room for more efficient farming. As the Ogallala Aquifer drops and the climate warms, the Great Plains are methodically destroying the exact system that saved them from destruction. They are removing their immune system just as the disease is coming back. The Prairie States Forestry Project proves something fundamental. Sometimes the most advanced technology for saving degraded land is understanding the physics of natural systems and deploying biology as engineering. Those 220 million trees were not just plants, they were machines designed to manipulate airflow and manufacture microclimate. The principle is universal. When land is dying, insert a biological mechanism that breaks the feedback loop. Use roots as pumps, use leaves as filters, use wood as architecture. The trees of the Great Plains worked so well that we forgot they were engineering at all. We started thinking of those shelter belts as scenery instead of machinery. Today, as farmers rip them out to make room for center pivot irrigation, they are stripping away their defense just as climate change brings the threat back. The most sophisticated technology we have ever deployed might be the simplest, using life to keep land alive.